My name's David Todd, and we are in Austin, Texas. It's August 27th, 2022. And first of all, just wanted to thank you for interest in whatever little mini thoughts that I can share with you. I guess a place to start would be my background. I grew up in Houston and went to school at Princeton, got an architecture degree, and then to Rice and was in the environmental engineering program, and then went to law school at Emory. And with that background, I sort of call myself an environmental lawyer, but actually my time is sort of evenly split between a family cattle operation. It's a cow-calf operation in Fayette and Colorado counties, and then a environmental history project that I've been involved with for the last 25 years or so. So I think that the topic today is this really interesting interplay between plants and animals, and just the important role that plants play in not only our living world, but also in our economy, and how critical their protection and wise stewardship is for all of us. My introduction to this has been through the cattle business. I think that there's this vision that the cattle business is involved in something that's kind of akin to a rodeo. There's chasing cows and roping them and hog tying them and dramatic stuff with branding them and dealing with rustlers and so on. But I think if you boil it down, at least ranching today, it's basically growing grass, which isn't nearly as dramatic, but I think that that's the reality of it. You can't have cows if you don't have grass. And so we've tried to focus on growing grass, growing forage, having a sustainable, diverse set of forage that will support the cattle that we are fortunate to have. And the interesting thing that I found is that maybe the most sustainable way to approach that is to think about the history, the natural history, how these grasslands evolved. And that maybe the clearest lens is to go back roughly 150 years before 1874, when there were still bison roaming the grasslands of Texas. And those grasslands were grazed very intensely when these bison herds, hundreds of thousands strong, would come through a particular part of the state. And the bison would be grouped really tightly because they worried about wolves that were surrounding them and chasing them. And they would graze very intensely. So when they came through, it was just mowed clean. And the fortunate thing, though, is that then the bison would move on, and they might not return to that area for months, years, maybe a decade, who knows. And during that period of time, those grasses would rebuild and regroup and recover. And when the bison came back again, it was a restored landscape. And so I think there are a lot of ranchers now that we try to follow this model, use the savory approach to grazing, which is basically intensive rotation, where on our little tract, we are rotating. In other words, we've cross-fenced our property into between 15 and 17 paddocks or pastures, and the cows will move from one pasture to the next, rotating around every week. It depends on how much rain we've got and what season of the year it is, but the idea is to mimic what those huge herds of bison would have done 150 years ago, where they would graze hard and then move away and not come back for a good period of time. For us, it's all much smaller. We may have cows out of a pasture for 2-3 months, but still, you get this recycling of of nutrients and the ability of these grasses to rebuild. And so that's been my introduction to this interplay between plants and livestock, animals, cows in our case. And that's just, I think, one really small example. And I've been fortunate to be working on this environmental history project for a number of years. And that's given me a lot of other sort of examples that I could share with you if you'd like. Just as an introduction, the group that we have is called the Conservation History Association of Texas. And we've had 3 different projects to date. One is called the Texas Legacy Project, which ran from roughly 1997 through 2018 or so. We produced a book. It was called the Texas Legacy Project, Stories of Courage and Conservation. We talked to about 240 people in the course of that. And the idea was to try to get the story of the environmental protection, public health protection, through the eyes of people who have really intimate, long-term, effective involvement in conservation. And so we went to 60 or 70 different towns, we went to 11 different ecoregions, and we really learned that people have many different kind of experiences with the environment. They bring to a different kinds of educational background, they have different politics, they have different problems they deal with. Some are focused on water or land or habitat, wildlife. Anyway, so that was a wonderful introduction, and it was a reminder that plants and habitat are just always integral to environmental sustainability and the sustainability of our whole economy and way of life. The second project we did was called the Texas Landscape Project, and that started in 2010 and went through about 2017 or 18, and we produced a book. It's called the Texas Landscape Project, Nature and People. And that's kind of the gist of it. It was this effort, instead of looking at people, as we did with that first project, Texas Legacy Project, this was looking at nature and localities, watersheds, airsheds, aquifers, things that were local, and how that controls and influences our lives. And again, a theme going through this was the kind of plants that could be supported in different parts of the state, depending on the soils and the rainfall, and what sort of spring flows there might be, how much asphalt there might be. So we got this story sort of drilled into us again and again when we looked at the data, because this project was really more about looking at government data, academic data, nonprofit collected information, and trying to use that to build these maps and then tell these stories about conservation in the state. But again and again, we were learning about the importance of the vegetative world, which is often mute. It doesn't sing out and talk to you and tell you I'm important. But again and again, I think we found that it is very important. The last project, at least to date, is called the Texas Fauna Project, and that started in 2019, so we're about 3 years into it. And the effort here is, rather than looking at people, as with the Texas Legacy Project, or place, as with the Texas Landscape Project, we're trying to tell the story of environmental conservation through animals and how those creatures and the people who care about them, and who've studied them and worked on restoring them, and they may be mammalogists or ichthyologists or economists or zookeepers or wildlife managers, but they all bring intense concern and experience and focus and years of their life to trying to take care of that animal and bring it back to some sort of sustainable sync with the natural world and the artificial world, the man-made world that we see today. So in the course of that, we've pulled together a big literature review, and then also done about 125 interviews with people from those different walks of life, and again tried to get the stories of the first person, primary source, unfiltered, you know, kind of experiences and insights and perspectives about the natural world looked at through, you know, what an individual animal might be able to tell us. So I think there's another example of this interplay between plants and animals that occurred to me when I went to Galveston Island not too long ago. And if you go about halfway down the island, there is a new sculpture, and it's of a bird. It's a large sculpture of an Eskimo curlew, and the Eskimo curlew is probably extinct, but it was last seen in some of the marsh grasses and upland areas of Galveston Island in 1961, 62, 1963. After that, there's been no confirmed observation of it. And so it's a really clearly a sad story. And I think it's an important story, though, and it's something that we just have to deal with, that animals go extinct. And there's a normal cycle of extinction. You know, millions of species have gone extinct. But increasingly, we're seeing species that are going extinct at the hand of man. You know, this is the great extinction, the sixth great extinction in the entire history of the world. And I think that the Eskimo curlew is a good example of how these extinctions happen and how oftentimes they can be traced back to changes in land use and changes in the plant kingdom. And the example here with Eskimo curlew is, and this is really simplified, is that on the one hand, they're very tasty, or they were, and they were shot out for use in restaurants and kitchens by market hunters. That was one problem. But another problem is not always as discussed, and that is that this Eskimo curlew, and you can sort of imagine it from the fact that it was in Galveston, but it was called an Eskimo curlew. It had this immense migration from the northern parts of Canada down to the Gulf Coast. And to fuel that migration, it survived and depended on something called the Rocky Mountain grasshopper. And that grasshopper was seen all along the Front Range of the Rockies in those shortgrass prairies. And 120 years ago, Western pioneer settlers arrived in that area, saw rich vegetation, deep soils, and they cultivated it. And as they cultivated it, the grasshopper, just declined and eventually was no longer seen. So the Eskimo curlew, which had relied on those grasshoppers, no longer had the sustenance to do this enormous migration of thousands of miles. And so it became weaker and weaker, fewer and fewer, and by the 1960s it winked out. And so I think it's a complicated story because it involves guns and plows and plants and grasshoppers, but one of the really key parts of this story is the loss of that grassland along the Front Range. So I think that's an important kind of Aesop's fable. It's an important moral to think about. And hopefully things won't be so dire that we won't have to go to those long ends, where you have an extinct animal, to understand the importance of vegetation and plants in our world. One other example, which I think is related to farming, and there might be a good story to tell, based in Texas. The South Texas brush country is this area that has changed a great deal since the 1930s. Originally, it was much of it was an area with very, very dense, spiny brush, and some of it was mesquite and huisach, but just a panoply of different species, and the density can maybe be suggested by just a couple of numbers. People have gone in and surveyed intact parts of this old brush country, and they've counted 3,000 to 8,000 stems per acre. So imagine something that you can't walk through, you can't crawl through, you wiggle through. And for a lot of people, there's no value to that. It's an obstacle to their livelihoods. So much of that country was bulldozed and chained and shredded and then replanted to soybeans or cotton or other crops. And it was people's livelihoods. They made money, they sold crops, products were made, but there was this wonderful creature that made its home in that brush country, and that's called the ocelot. And its numbers are down to between 50 and 80 in the United States, really only found in this southern corner of Texas, which has seen such drastic changes in that whole landscape. So it's not like this animal was not really overhunted. It really didn't have a lot of the pressures on it. It was just that its landscape, its ecosystem, the plants it relied on evaporated. And so this, is a very specific landscape it needed, and it was no longer there to support it. And so now we have between 50 and 80 of these animals left, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife are trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But what that requires is sort of turning the clock back. And this is what some people call the Verde Revolution. It's not the Green Revolution that was about industrial agriculture. It was about how do we reconstruct a native landscape. And what they're finding, it's really difficult to do, to rebuild something. It's easy to take it apart with a bulldozer, but to then try to get that structure back and get the succession right is really challenging. So people are estimating that the cost of revegetating these lands as brush country like they used to be, that would support the ocelot, can cost as much as $5,000 an acre. And you think that that's more than most of that land cost. So to re-shroud it in this brush system is not an easy thing to do. And then not only is it costly, but just the ability to try to protect it from the invasive exotics that are, constantly threatening to overwhelm these plants that you've carefully installed is a whole nother challenge in addition to the cost of it. So I think it's just a nice reminder that we should always be cautious of dismantling things, thinking that we're improving things, because oftentimes we'll find out after we've rearranged the natural environment, removed plants, put in other plants, that the way that whole system worked is gone. Yeah, so let's talk about another example of the interaction between plants and animals. And the animal that I have in mind is the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a small, meek, mild, timid bird that's found throughout the southeastern United States. It was probably the dominant woodpecker in the southeastern pine forest. But certainly by the 60s, it was in serious trouble. By the 80s, it was recognized as being in serious decline and was declared endangered. And like a lot of these stories, it wasn't clear immediately why, because the red-cockaded woodpecker is not on anybody's menu. This is not a creature that was hunted. It wasn't that sort of direct threat to it. But apparently, as the data started coming in from the U.S. Forest Service and from biologists and academic institutions, they started to realize that what had happened was the plant that the red-cockaded woodpecker relied on, principally the longleaf pine, had been gradually eradicated from much of the South. The longleaf pine was really honored because it was just this wonderful hard wood that was used for structures, everything from boats to floors, and there was a lot of it. But by about 1920, much had been cut out. There was this bonanza of logging, and it ran from the Carolinas all the way down to East Texas. And East Texas was really the last area to be logged out. So these 200-300-year-old longleaf pine were removed. And the consequence of that was that the red-cockaded woodpecker relied on the longleaf pine for its cavities where it would nest. And it wasn't just any longleaf pine. It needed longleaf pines that were at least 80 years old, because by that age they start to get something called heart rot fungus often, and that softens the wood inside the trunk of the tree, and it makes it soft enough for the red-cockaded woodpecker to peck its little hole to use it as a nest, and not only for it to use it as a nest, but also the pileated woodpecker and flying squirrels and other snakes use these cavities. So it's a really important kind of keystone species. But that keystone species, the red-cockaded woodpecker, couldn't do its thing if it didn't have the longleaf pine. Now, longleaf pine had not only been cut out by the 20s, but one other thing had happened. Really, since some of the great fires in Wisconsin around the turn of the last century, the sort of basic approach for the Forest Service was to suppress fire in national forests and in private woodlands. And they did that very effectively. And the consequence was that this ecosystem where the longleaf pine had long been dominant relied on periodic fires, because the longleaf pine has this really thick armor plating. It's almost like a fireproofing. So as those fires would come through the old longleaf pine forests of the South, all the competing trees would get hit back or even eliminated. So those longleaf pines could survive and then in turn support a bird like the red-cockaded woodpecker. But when fire was removed and the red-cockaded woodpeckers suffered from that, and you also had the longleaf pines being cut out, it shouldn't have been a surprise that this bird had problems. Now, I mean, what's fortunate is that there's been a lot of effort in recent years to reinstitute fire into that ecosystem, but there are concerns because there are people living in and around all these woodlands, and there's natural fear, especially as climate change dries out a lot of these woodlands, that these fires can spread and spread quickly. So there's some pushback there. The other thing that is happening is that I think I mentioned before that these longleaf pine really don't support the heart rot fungus until they're about 80 years old. And our current way of managing land is really based on private ownership. And you know, generations come and generations go. Estates are filed, probates are, you know, filed with the county courthouse, and death duties are paid, and oftentimes these lands are sold long before 80 years has passed. Maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 30 years. And so these trees never get to be the age that they need to be to have that fungus attack them to be able to host these birds. So it's just this wildly complicated story, but I think it's another example of how there's this intimate connection between a plant and an animal, between longleaf pine and the red-cockaded woodpecker. Let me start, if I could, with the story about bunch grasses. So some of the great cattle empires in Texas were in the coastal prairie. Shanghai Pierce is probably one of the best known. Mm-hmm. And they found the coastal prairie to be ideal for raising cattle, huge herds of cattle. And these animals relied on little blue stem and big blue stem and Indian grass and eastern gamma grass. These are all bunch grasses. And they're called in the business, the cattle operation business, ice cream grasses. These are the grasses that cows really like to eat. And they'll eat them first. And they'll eat them down to the ground. And so they will often eradicate them. And so what a lot of ranchers did, especially after the drought of the 1950s, is that they started to go to a kind of a carpet grass, typically common Bermuda, coastal Bermuda. There are other grasses that were also imported, typically old world grasses that were adapted for really dry conditions. And then they would fertilize and irrigate these new exotic grasses. And for many years that worked really well because electricity to run your pumps, to run the irrigation was cheap. The fertilizers that you needed, the NPK, the nitrogen-based urea and so on, which was also oil-based, natural gas-based, was cheap. And then, so folks really went whole hog into planting these exotic grasses. And it worked well for the cows for a while, but I guess the story sort of splits off here. It's difficult for the cows in the long term when oil prices went up and fertilizer costs and energy costs went up, and you can no longer fertilize and irrigate these carpet grasses. But the other thing that happened in sort of the natural world is that those bunch grasses were the homelands for a number of upland grass birds. And there are two birds that get a lot of attention in Texas. One is the northern bobwhite quail, which is probably the favored upland bird for hunting. It's just people love the bird. It's a whole culture of raising dogs to flush these birds and to find these birds, and they're very tasty and so on. But they adapted for the old bunch grasses, as did a bird called the Atwater prairie chicken, which 100 years ago were seen in the hundreds of thousands, millions perhaps, in the coastal prairies around, really from Houston south and west. And after these new grasses were brought in, they and the northern bobwhite quail no longer had the bunch grasses that they had evolved in. And the problem for them was that, as I understand it, was these bunch grasses gave them two things. It gave them seeds that they could eat, but then also cover. If you can imagine a forest at our scale, where you have canopy trees above that protect you from the sun. Well, for a small bird that's maybe that tall, these bunch grasses were like being in a forest, and they could sort of follow this maze, this labyrinth between the different bunch grasses, and they were protected from hawks and falcons and owls and other predators, coyotes, wolves, who couldn't see these birds that were running around underneath this grass cover. Well, when the carpet grass came in, they didn't have those little channels, those roads and lanes to protect themselves and to be able to move around. And so now the Atwater prairie chicken is down to maybe 50 to 100 in the wild. They're critically endangered. And similarly, the northern bobwhite quail has gone into serious decline. And it's again something that just goes back to plants. And not just individual plants, but a whole ecosystem of plants. You know, that it's not the little blue stem alone. It's the little blue stem, the big blue stem, the Indian grass, the eastern gamma grass, the switchgrass. You need them all. And I think we're only now realizing how complicated that whole interlocking plant system is, and how reliant creatures are that we never probably put together with those plants. But it's all, as Muir said, it's all connected. And we need to start thinking in that more holistic way so that we can reassemble the natural world that we all rely on. My 2 cents. So there is a whole suite of creatures called dung beetles, and they're very diverse. They're very ancient. They've been recognized by cultures going back to the Egyptians that celebrated the scarab. But they were also very important for grasslands here in Texas and in the livestock that, and prior to cattle and sheep and goats, the bison that roam through Texas. And the role that those dung beetles played and how they're related to plants runs sort of like this. Imagine a very large cow wandering by, decides to relieve himself or herself. The manure goes on the ground. These dung beetles have an incredibly sensitive sense of smell. They smell it, they come and they start to drill into it and roll it into a ball, and then they will pull it into little cavities and tunnels underneath the ground, where they store it, and their young feed on these, and it's a very involved kind of a system. But the wonderful thing about it is that the dung beetles are essentially recycling all that carbon that is in the manure from the bulls and the cows and the calves. And so that carbon is going into the soil, courtesy of these dung beetles. And then the dung beetles are also aerating the soil. They're bringing oxygen in. So they're really making the soil a living thing. And then that soil is enriched with the carbon, and it supports the plants and the root systems of those plants that then feeds the cows or the sheep or the goats or the deer or all the herbivores that are reliant on that grassland. And then those animals poop again, and the dung beetles take that manure and they roll it and they put it in the ground, and the whole cycle starts once more. It's a beautiful sort of virtuous cycle. And the problem, though, is that ranchers started to dose their animals with parasiticides, and the typical chemical was called ivermectin. And this was good in a sense because it treated the worms and other parasites that might have been afflicting their animals, but they also, these parasiticides were persistent. They were long lasting, and they went into their manure, and then the dung beetles consumed the chemical and they died. And so you've cut that connection in that cycle, that carbon cycle, and you've hurt the chemical nutrients that are going into the soil. They're supporting the root systems, that are supporting the grasses, that are in turn supporting the livestock, they're supporting the rancher, they're supporting the grocer, that are feeding the people that go to the grocery store. So it's a whole kind of involved cycle that goes down to these little scarab beetles that are doing the kind of ignominious task of rolling poop around. But it's important, and I think we need to pay attention. And the fortunate thing is that if you do the rotational grazing, if you keep moving the cows around, you take care of all of those parasites, because the cows move on, parasites are left behind. You know, the cows are not in that pasture for another 2, 3, 4 months. And so by the time they get back, those parasites have died a natural death. You didn't need to use the parasiticide. And so, you know, the hope of people who care about these little dung beetles and their poop, you know, are advising that just think about other ways to solve that problem that don't involve the chemicals that break that carbon cycle. I think that it might be useful to think about plants and animals, and that interaction that I think we're all seeing and experiencing through the lens of different kinds of human activity. And there are lots of other lenses, you know, frames that you could use, but let's maybe try that. And I would start with farming, which is certainly one of the most ancient kinds of human use of land. And one example that comes to mind from that kind of land use is the role of milkweed and echinacea and other kinds of plants that people have not seen much value in, but are critical to monarch butterflies. And you know, there are these amazing migrations of monarch butterflies that come out of central Mexico, the highlands, and they funnel up and through Texas, crossing the border near Eagle Pass, and then fanning out into the Ohio River Valley and up into Canada. And in the course of that migration, they cross all these farmlands. And those farmlands increasingly are very efficiently, cost-effectively cultivated. And the old hedgerows that often divided up farm fields are no longer there. You know, the typical tract size of farms is getting larger and larger. So the places that milkweed used to grow in the sort of leftover spots, those hedgerows, those swales and so on, they've been planted to crops. And the kind of crops that are being increasingly planted are what's called as Roundup ready. And so these plants are infused with a really high tolerance for herbicides. And so these crops can resist glyphosate, you know, this really effective herbicide. But anything that doesn't have that genetic makeup that the crop has, that gives it the resistance to glyphosate, is dead. And that's what's happened to milkweed from, you know, northern Mexico all the way up into southern Canada. And so that leaves no fodder for these monarch butterflies to both give them nutrition and often to give them a biochemical resistance to predators. And as a consequence, the great monarch butterfly migrations, which were witnessed by Christopher Columbus, you know, over 500 years ago, are now really collapsing. And there's good signs that the counts on these monarch butterflies are down by 90%, and they're being proposed for endangered species listing. And so I think this is a good example, not just of a worrisome trend, but it's also a place where people can make a difference and try to engage and help restore, protect these insects. And there are a couple of ways that can be done. There's a lot of monitoring, citizen science that's going on called Monarch Watch, where people are trying to understand, where are these monarchs? When are they passing through? How many are there? And that's sort of the first great step towards solving problems, just understanding the scope of it. And the second thing that's happening, which I think is really exciting, is that utilities and highway departments and others that own and manage great strips of real estate are starting to plant milkweed of various kinds that can help support the monarchs that are passing through. So I think that those are a couple of measures that are exciting, but I don't think they should take away from the fact that it's a serious circumstance that you try to do what we can to make things better. There is a bird that's a Texas native, raised and reared right here in Texas. It's called the golden-cheeked warbler, and it's known mostly in the hill country, and it's there because there are a certain kind of a woodland that's basically ash juniper and then a variety of different kinds of oaks. And the ash juniper is important to the golden-cheeked warbler because as it gets older and more mature, its bark starts peeling off in these strips, and these tendrils are what the golden-cheeked warbler uses to make its nest. And the beautiful thing about it is that these nests, because they're made of the materials that are right there, they're perfectly camouflaged. And so this bird is really secretive, and it's a natural form of protection for its nestlings. And then what's really nice also is that because the juniper is associated with the oaks have certain kinds of insects that are just underneath the bark and are trailing along the bark that are the key food sources for the golden-cheeked warbler. So it's sort of like the bird has its home right next to the grocery store. It's perfect. The problem is that the juniper has had a lot of interest from different quarters for years. If you go back to the 1870s, 1880s, when barbed wire was introduced for ranching to try to pen up cattle and sheep and goats and so on, the go-to fence post to lay those barbed wire strands on was the ash juniper. Very hard, very rot resistant wood. So these folks called the cedar choppers. There's a whole culture of people that came down from Appalachia, and they lived in that whole juniper belt, cedar belt, to the northwest of San Antonio and to the west of Austin. And for decades, really through the 60s, they logged selectively, but they logged all the best and oldest juniper from these forests that were in the hill country of Texas. And so that was the favored habitat for this golden-cheeked warbler. That was a problem for the warbler. But then also there were subsidies from the federal government for brush clearing. And juniper was sort of seen as just another flavor of brush. And ranchers could get a cost share for them to bring in bulldozers and chainsaws to cut out these stands of juniper and other trees in the woodlands of the hill country so that they could graze it for sheep and goats and cattle. And then the third thing that has happened in more recent years, really since this 1970s, is as San Antonio, New Braunfels, San Marcos, Buda, Austin, really, that whole crescent of population has developed and sprawled. It's moved up into these beautiful hills to the west and north of those communities. And that's the homeland of both the ash juniper and this bird, the golden cheek warbler. And so many of those lands have been cleared for homes and stores and offices and warehouses and gas stations and roads and so on. And so these trees are no longer there in the same numbers and the same age that are needed to support this golden cheek warbler. So it was declared endangered, and there was a terrible political pushback against it. A whole group called the Take Back Texas, sort of a private property rights effort, and so that has been a very divisive kind of period that rent the farmers and ranchers from the environmental community, and I think it's had these sort of social and political effects that go far behind and beyond the lives of the golden cheek warbler and these woodlands, to a whole sort of what I think has been a very destructive, self-destructive kind of contest about how lands and wild things can be protected and restored in Texas, because there's been so much distrust about how to manage this bird. When really there's probably a lot of common ground, but it's a very hot button issue. So anyway, that's, I think, an example of how there's this connection between a tree, the ash juniper and the oaks that are part of that system, the golden cheek warbler, and then the entire sort of conservation and agricultural community. So I think there's a lesson there that's pretty instructive. Hydrilla is an interesting plant. It's an exotic, it's an invasive. It was brought to this country, I think in the 1950s, roughly. And it was brought here as an aquarium plant to decorate, the fish tanks of dentists' offices and doctors' offices and our own little, bedrooms and unfortunately, in 1959, the hydrilla escaped and it got out into the natural environment. And it's, as you might expect for something that was a good aquarium plant, it was very hardy, very difficult to kill, spread easily, spread quickly, but it was doing all this in the natural environment. And by the late 60s, it had arrived in Texas and was found in Lake Conroe, which had recently been constructed, and as a source of water for the city of Houston, but also, frankly, as a development scheme. It was something where people could buy up lots overlooking this beautiful lake, and they could go out on the lake and they could fish and they could water ski. But the one sort of fly in the ointment was this exotic aquarium plant, which now its aquarium was Lake Conroe. And it just boomed, and it spread across Lake Conroe to the extent that boats couldn't go in there, and people couldn't water ski, and people couldn't go fishing. And when they looked out from their lovely new home, all they saw was this plant that was sort of covering everything that they had imagined when they saw lake in front of Conroe. The lake was no longer really visible. So they approached the legislature after Parks and Wildlife said, we're not going to get involved in this. And they got the legislature to order release of a creature called the grass carp, which is a Asiatic carp. It's related to koi. I think probably a similar fish. And they released this grass carp into Lake Conroe, and as its name kind of suggests, it ate all the grass and, in fact, all the aquatic vegetation, hydrilla and more. And so I think the homeowners were happy until they realized that the grass carp continued to eat all the vegetation in the lake, and also because it was such a effective eater of everything in the lake, it crowded out the bass and the catfish and the species that they wanted to have there. And then secondly, the grass carp escaped, and so it managed to get down past the dam into the Trinity River, into Trinity Bay, and now it's seen in many ecosystems in Texas. And so there are different levels of this. There's the story of how an exotic creature can become a very invasive, upsetting creature in native ecosystems. The havoc that the grass carp wreaked on the Texas scene. But I think also just the impact that one plant that was brought in for one purpose, very confined, put it in an aquarium, well, hydrilla gets loose, and now there's a whole core of people that call themselves hydrilla killers, and they try to figure out ways to control it, and you've got this cycle of using herbicides to try to control it, and mechanical means, basically choppers. They look like sort of lawnmowers on water, and it's a very expensive, complicated management problem. And I think it's just a reminder that vegetation is very important, but its locale is equally important. And the hydrilla and hyacinth and all its relatives, they belong in certain places. You take them out of that circumstance, that environment, put them somewhere else, and you may have hell to pay. Once upon a time, again in South Texas, there was this amazing grassland, and it was home to a creature called the northern Aplomado falcon, and this was a raptor that focused on hunting other birds, grassland birds in particular. And with the development of ranching in that country, first with over 1 million sheep that were in South Texas, and then in subsequent years, very large herds of cattle. Much of that land, which is drought prone, was easily overgrazed. And so you had bare ground and the possibility of woodies, principally weesage and mesquite, but other plants coming up through what was once a tight grassland. And the consequence of that was that this bird, the northern Aplomado, which was declared endangered about 35 years ago, became rare because its ecosystem, its plant world, changed and evaporated. And so where it had once been able to cruise low over grasslands and pick off these other grassland birds, now there were these shrubs and trees that were blocking its passage, and it could no longer hunt the way it was genetically attuned to do. It evolved to hunt in that way. And furthermore, as the grassland receded and these shrubs and trees came in, the birds that they would prey on, which were grassland dependent as well, they were no longer there. And then lastly, because there were now these trees and bushes, there were roost points, there were perching places for great horned owls, which were preying on the northern Apple falcon, to take them out. So those combinations of threats to the Apple falcon really took hold and saw the falcon pretty much eradicated in Texas by, I guess it was maybe the late 50s or so. There have been wonderful efforts since then to reintroduce the Apple falcon, but it's again this story of how difficult it is to reassemble something that has been dismantled. And I think there's a lesson to the story of the northern Apple falcon, that you may see a grassland and think that it is only good for the sheep that you put out there or the cattle that you run, but there are these other creatures that don't maybe have an immediate kind of presence in your mind, like the Apple falcon, that are also relying on it. And when you maybe overgraze something because you're trying to keep your livestock operation going, there are all these collateral costs and externalized effects that you may not be taking into account. So it's just, I think it's a lesson of like, respect your elders, respect these grasslands that are ancient systems and that operate in ways that we are only just now starting to understand, and only in like very dim ways. So this is kind of a personal story for me. I grew up going hunting, duck hunting, with my father, goose hunting as well, at a place called Eagle Lake Rod and Gun Club, which is just outside of a little community in Colorado County called Eagle Lake. And when you come into Eagle Lake, there's a big billboard that says, "Goose hunting capital of the world." And they were serious about it. It was a major part of the culture and the activity and the economy for this little town. There were, we called them speckle bellies, but there were snow geese, speckle bellies, lesser fronted geese that would come in the middle of the fall and then visit all these rice fields that were outside of Eagle Lake. But what happened is that after this same drought that we've discussed before, 2008, 2009, into 2009 and 10, occurred, the Lower Colorado River Authority was sort of between a rock and a hard place. They had less and less water in the highland lakes, in Lake Buchanan and Lake Travis in particular. And so this pie of water was growing smaller and smaller, and they had to decide how to slice up that pie between residents of the city of Austin, large industrial users, agricultural users. The folks who got the short end of the stick were the agricultural users, which ironically were some of the most senior water right holders, these rice farmers in particular in Colorado County and further downstream Wharton County. So the LCRA took the unprecedented step of cutting off deliveries to these rice farmers. And so many rice cultivators either went fallow or totally went out of business, or in some cases they drilled wells to try to just limp through this time when they weren't getting water deliveries from the river. And that went on for 4 or 5 years. And during that time, rice cultivation was just decimated in Colorado County and Wharton County. It was nowhere like it had been for 2 generations before. Well, the geese, remember we talked about the geese and the goose hunting capital of the world? Well, the geese that used to come there, they relied on the little leftover waste grain that was left in the fields. They would come in and they would eat that grain that was left over from the rice cultivation. And so without the water being delivered, And without that rice being grown, the geese no longer had food to support them. And so they quit coming to Colorado County and Wharton County, and have done sort of, as I understand it, have short stopped, where now they stop in Arkansas and they no longer come this far south. And so, part of this, the explanation is water deliveries, rice cultivation, less waste rice, fewer geese. But another situation which also bears on the natural world and on plants is climate change, because these same geese have limited resources, and they, given a choice, they would rather migrate less far. With climate change, there are areas where they can still find forage and open water that's not frozen over further north. So they're not coming as far north because they don't need to fly that extra 300, 400, 500 miles, because climate change affords them the chance to stay further north. And so now you're seeing geese that are much further north, and they're not coming to Texas anymore. And this goes back again to climate change, water policy, and plants, crops in the state. I think there's a story that could be told that would illustrate the connection again between plants and animals. In this case, we might use the frame of water policy in the state. And just a very sort of short, condensed version of water law in the state is that the state of Texas began issuing permits and rights to private actors, municipalities, industrial firms around 120 years ago, about 1900. And they allocated water from the various rivers in the state to these various actors who would hold those as legal rights. It's property. And the trick is that those rights were allocated, they were sort of meted out to the various folks at the table without any consideration about the fish that were in those rivers, the plants that were along those rivers, or the birds that might have fed along those rivers. In other words, imagine that you're playing poker and there are 4 or 5 people around the table. And you've got the industrial user there, and you have the municipal user there, and then you've got an agricultural user there, and then you've got all the critters that are in that other chair. Well, you gave cards to all the other people, but you didn't give any cards to the trees and the animals. And that was probably not really recognized until the economy and the population in Texas grew to enough of an extent where a lot of those water rights were actually put into use, and those diversions and those impoundments happen. And some of the sort of where the I'm going to just say XYZ hit the fan was in 2008 and 2009 when we had a very serious drought that really ran through 2010 or 11. And this played out in the following way. In the San Marcos River Basin, the Guadalupe, the Blanco, which all sort of funnel down into Aransas Bay. And Aransas Bay is part of the home of the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, which in turn is the wintering grounds for a bird called the whooping crane, which is one of the most endangered birds on the planet. They got down to about 15, maybe 16, maybe 17 birds in 1941. That was all there were in the wild. And there's been enormous resources, staff, dollars, land protection has been put into protecting this bird and bringing it back. And now we're up to 500-600 birds, but it's all contingent on having enough water coming into the refuge, and that water is being diverted, and that really becomes apparent in 2008, 2009, when 23 of these birds died. And that's about 15% of the entire wild population at the time. So it was, for an endangered bird, for a very rare bird, this was just, red lights were blinking, alarms were going off. This is a really serious situation. And so a group called the Aransas Project filed suit, and they made the case that the state and the river authorities that control the water going to Aransas Bay were not taking into account the amount of water that was needed by this endangered species. And the water that was needed was partly so that the bird had water to drink, but it was also so that a plant, the wolfberry, that the whooping crane ate and really relied on for its sustenance, it needed that fresh water as well. And so when the water was diverted and impounded and lost because of drought, the wolfberry died back, and the whooping crane suffered, and many died. And so, this litigation proceeded, and actually the district court, federal court, agreed with the Aransas Project that water allocations need to be changed to protect the wolfberry and in turn protect the water flows and the whooping crane. The Fifth Circuit overruled, and one of the fortunate things is that it could have been that the environmentalists, the folks trying to protect the wolfberry and the whooping crane would have been sort of left at loose ends, but actually the GBRA, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, has gone into negotiation over the last, 5-6 years to try to secure water rights for the wolfberry and the birds and all the estuarine system that relies on reliable freshwater inflows. So I think this is another way to sort of think about the connection between plants, animals, water, our legal system, our economy, our population. And just again, I think it's a reminder that plants are really important and sometimes neglected, but I think in the end we need to recognize how critical they are. We had a similar drought that wasn't just 6 months long, like I guess the one we're going through right now. It was 7 years long. It was called the critical drought. It was the period roughly from 1950 to 1957 in Texas, and this drought was really severe, very long, and a lot of the decision makers in Texas naturally worried about what the economy and the population of the state would do if our water systems, our water delivery and storage systems weren't more robust and dependable. And so by 1960, the Texas Water Development Board, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers went strong into building dams and impounding waters in every major river, from the east, from the Sabine to the Trinity to the Angelina, the Neches, the Brazos, the Colorado. They all got dams. About 180 major dams. That's dams that impound more than 5,000 acre-feet of water were built in really the course of maybe 20 years. It was very rapid, and I think that a lot of us did not think about what the impact of changing these water regimes was going to be like. What did it mean to impound these bottomland hardwoods and flood them? And I think one of the effects that we're starting to understand is that these river bottoms were home to just a panoply of different hardwoods, pecans, red oaks, white oaks, and all these trees produced a great deal of mast, from acorns to pecans, that supported birds, and squirrels and deer. The squirrels, of course, very reliant on mast. White-tailed deer, very reliant on mast. And there's a whole culture and economy of hunting. I mean, in many small towns, the hunting rights are one of the biggest parts of what pays for people's food and gas and their car note and their home mortgage. It's a big deal. And yet, because of the inundation of a lot of these river bottoms, these riparian corridors, we don't have the kind of reliable food source for everything from as small as a squirrel to as large as a white-tailed deer. And I don't think this was something that was anticipated. I don't think there was any malevolent intent, but it's put a lot of these economies in a more precarious place, and certainly the ecosystems and the animals that rely on those trees and those mast sources that are no longer there. There's a really interesting creature called the American paddlefish, and it is one of the most ancient creatures. It really goes back tens of millions of years. But in the last 50 or 60 years, folks have realized that it is in pretty dire straits. And the reason that it's having trouble is also reflected in water policy and in plant life. And the connection here is that a dam was built years ago that keeps Caddo Lake, where these American paddlefish are found, at a constant level. And then upstream of Caddo Lake, there's a dam that was put in called Lake of the Pines. And that prevented the old water regime from carrying through, where you had low water during droughts, and then you had flood flows during great rainstorms. And so the bald cypress, which had evolved in Lake Caddo, needed those droughts when water levels were low in Lake Caddo, so that new volunteers, new recruitment could occur, where young bald cypress could start and propagate and grow into mature bald cypress. That was no longer happening because of this constant water level was flooding out the grounds where those young saplings could come up. The other thing that was happening was that the American paddlefish relied on the old flood pulses to scour out the places where they spawned, these sort of gravel beds or hard bottom. And so with the dam upstream, those flood flows were no longer coming through and triggering their instinct to go spawn and providing that place for their eggs to lay and then be fertilized and become cute little American paddlefish. So, again, this is sort of an example of how the fortunes of the bald cypress and of the American paddlefish are tied together, and then they're also connected to our water policy. And one of the fortunate things is that there's a group called the Caddo Lake Institute, which is releasing young American paddlefish, and is also negotiating with the Cypress Creek River Authority to try to manage that river system in a way where some of these flood flows can be replicated again as they used to happen before these dams were put in. But it's a learning process, and the clock is always ticking because these are living creatures. The bald cypress have a lifespan. American paddlefish also have mortality, and so you need to figure this out quickly and try to put some cures and some measures in place to recover them. Here's another example that may hit a little bit closer to home, because we all go to the grocery store, and maybe you like almonds, maybe you like cherries, maybe you like honey. Well, all these products and foods rely on the honeybee. The honeybee, of course, makes the honey, but it also pollinates the cherries and the almonds and many other plants, I mean, such as alfalfa and sweet clover that support the cows and other livestock that we use for meat. And what's been happening in recent years is that a new class of pesticides has been developed to try to protect our crops. And these insecticides, I'm going to try to say this right, neonicotinoid, affect the nervous system of bees. And it affects their ability to learn new tasks. It affects their ability to forage. It affects their ability to navigate. And so beekeepers are seeing these colonies collapse. And it's a worrisome thing, because not only for the sake of this creature, these honeybees, which have this incredible sociobiology, the operation of their hive is just fascinating, but it's sort of like this group brain, which is so effective. But it's also something to remind ourselves that so much of what we see in the grocery store is reliant on this bee and its pollination efforts. And if we use the insecticides to protect those crops, we're going to lose the bee and we're going to lose the crops, and we're going to go to the grocery shelves and be surprised that the prices are higher, the availability is less, maybe some products are not available at all. And it sounds a little bit, apocalyptic, but I think it's a good thing to remember that our food systems are very much based on the natural world, and we can't just snap our fingers and say, this is what we want, and not pay attention to the delicacy and the interactions between plants and animals and our food systems. So that's just another example of sort of plants and animals and people. So I feel very lucky to be interviewed by Scooter Cheatham and Abby and Lynn Marshall here today at Useful Wild Plants, and I think it's definitely worth mentioning Useful Wild Plants, which I really admire, because they have been thinking about how to use and celebrate and share plants and their wonderful chemical properties and housing uses and ways they can be used for tools and materials of every imaginable sort, and just the overarching kind of picture that plants are the very basis of our civilization, and they need to be celebrated and protected and used in appropriate ways. And I would like to sort of go back in time a little bit to how I got in with this group of people and got to know them and love them. And it started in the late 80s, I believe, and my family was going through some estate planning, and we had some kind of nutty environmental ideas, and we decided to put some of the funds that were going through this estate transfer into a foundation, and we call it the Ray Charitable Lead Annuity Trust, which is a very long name for a small organization, a small fund, but it was a great introduction to this slice of the American world, which is not bound and tied into sort of short-term considerations. We had the luxury of thinking about long time, about not just fiscal quarters and annual reports, but where do we want to be as a economy and a population and a society in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Not that we could make an entire difference in it, but we could think in those terms. That could be our frame. Our time frame could be much longer than what other people are really forced to consider. And so we could make grants that we thought would nudge our world in a better way, that would send us off to that Eden that I think we all would like to return to. And so we gave grants to wonderful organizations like the Useful Wild Plants, and got to know people who were thinking these really powerful thoughts. And it was, who were running these organizations and doing this really critical work. And of course, Scooter Cheatham and Lynn Marshall were totally central to that. And it's been just a wonderful experience for us, because we had this ringside view of what people were doing that was good-hearted and smart and thinking about this long term, which is so key, because so many of us, I think, are distracted with just getting through each day for totally understandable reasons. I mean, we all have to put food on the table and pay our mortgages and pay our rent and pay for fuel and so on. And some of these bigger concepts, these longer term developments and trends, sometimes don't get the attention that they deserve. And so I'm so glad that Useful Wild Plants is reminding us and pressing on us and informing us about how important plants are, and how critical it is that as we go forward the next years and decades, that we make sure that we make the best of this incredibly rare planet that is one of the only ones we know of that has life, that has chlorophyll, that has this plant world, and we should take care of it and make sure that it will take care of us in turn. Well, so I'm looking at my shoe here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's my connection with the ground, and it has a footprint, and I think that as all of us look down our legs and look at our feet, it's important to think about what our footprint is, and not just the soles of our Adidas or Nikes or Oxfords, but what is our metaphorical or economic footprint, and what's our carbon footprint? I think is something we often hear about, and I think it's sometimes hard to consider because it's well beyond what we can see and touch, but it's very much a part of our impact, our effect on the natural world. And so I would urge people who may have a chance to see this to think about what impacts they have on water and plants and air and wildlife and all the components of this natural world that are our life support system, and try to take those considerations into account in the decisions that you make. What kind of car do you drive? Is it a high efficiency car? Do you even drive a car? Do you ride the bus? Do you ride a bike? Do you walk? Or if you're thinking about the home that you live in, is it well insulated? What kind of glass? Does it reflect light and heat? What kind of air conditioning system does it have? Is it a high efficiency unit? Think about when you go to work. Is the place where you work working towards a more sustainable economy? And you don't have to work for an environmental nonprofit. I had a friend who asked this question, well, what can I do? I work for a carpet company. What does that possibly have to do with the natural world? And he started to think about it. He realized, there are natural fibers that you can make carpet out of, instead of petrochemical based fibers. Or you can make a carpet that will last for 10 years, or you can make a carpet that will last for 20 or 30 and won't need to be replaced. Or you can make carpet that comes in small squares, so if you get a stain on the carpet, you don't have to pull up the whole carpet, the wall to wall, 20 foot by 30 foot or whatever it is. You just pull up a 1 foot by 1 foot square. So there's less material going in and there's less waste coming out. So I think there are lots of examples like that. Those are just a few. But I'm sure you get the idea that we just need to think more holistically about, the footprint, and make sure that it's as small and compact and condensed as possible, and that we're not wasting our time on this planet and just harming things in ways that we could avoid it. So we have the wonderful topic today about plants in the modern world, and the importance of plants, and how we can really recognize and make the best use of plants. The story I want to tell that I think might be kind of a good way to illustrate some of the issues has to do with a place in Austin, Texas called the Blund Creek Nature Preserve. And the preserve was originally a dairy farm, not a large one, about 40 acres, about 2 miles south of the state capitol. And it was grazed for decades. And by about the 1950s, it was pretty much bare of the grass and forage that had supported those cows. But meanwhile, the area around what was to be the preserve in the future had changed a great deal. There had been a lot of development. And there was a community that was built, a subdivision called Sherwood Oaks. And that was built about the same time that the airport here, which was an air base, needed housing for officers and staff who were at Bergstrom Air Base. And so they built this, was a very typical post-war community with 2 and 3 bedroom houses, and the interaction with this preserve is kind of what has been very interesting, because as soon as people moved in, they wanted to have a green space around their house. They wanted to have a garden, a lawn, and many of them planted things that were suggested by their local landscaper, or what was available. And they planted things like ligustrum. They planted things like nandina. They planted things like chinaberry. And that way they'd have a hedge and maybe some bushes and a tree, and pretty soon it looked like a lived-in home. And the effect of all that was, though, that this preserve, which abutted Sherwood Oaks subdivision, was just like a sponge for all the seeds that were cast off or carried over by birds from those ligustrum plants and those nandina plants and the chinaberry and the paper mulberry and many assorted plants that were planted in Texas, but they did not come from Texas. And a lot of them were Asiatic, and as it turned out, very invasive. And so if we kind of fast forward from the 50s to the late 80s, this 40-acre dairy farm is bought from the Storm family, who were going to build a very large apartment complex there, and it became a preserve, which is a wonderful thing. But while this land was set aside and appeared as a green space on City of Austin maps, the plant world was continuing to do its thing. And seeds were being spread by birds, seeds were propagating, germinating, those plants were growing up. And so by about the mid-aughts, 2000, 2005, this preserve, which at one point had been a typical central Texas grassland with maybe a riparian corridor going along Blund Creek, have become a incredibly dense forest of ligustrum. And these ligustrum are a wonderful evergreen plant, very drought tolerant, make a wonderful hedge, but if you leave them be, they will become a tree. And so we found, when we came there in 2005, trying to figure out how to manage this place, it's just this nonprofit group, a bunch of volunteers. These ligustrum were about every 8 to 12 inches apart. It was the most dense thicket you could imagine. And many of the ligustrum weren't your 3-foot hedge like they were in the Sherwood Oaks subdivision. They were 30-foot tall trees with trunks like that. And so in 2005, we put together a little nonprofit group called the Blund Creek Partnership. And over the past 17 years, we've brought in literally thousands of volunteers with saws and clippers and what we call weed wrenches to pull all that ligustrum out of the preserve and try to start returning that property to what would be a typical Central Texas natural environment. And it's been a wonderful experience because we brought all these people, 2 and 3 year olds up to 80-year-olds, folks who come there as master naturalists, people who don't have any experience with this at all, people who are professional biologists, others who are just learning about the natural environment. But, coming together to try to wrench this property back from being an example of what sort of a Chinese ecosystem with ligustrum and andina and China berry and paper mulberry and so on, to one that we would find with all the plants that are at home here in Central Texas. And it's been a wonderful community building effort. It's been a wonderful environmental education project, but it's also been a reminder of how exotic plants, invasive plants, can be a real headache, and they can undermine and cut back on the kind of habitat that's necessary for everything from birds to little terrestrial mammals, because that ligustrum and andina and so on is so dense and so powerful as a rival to the native habitat that it really didn't support the kind of creatures that call Texas home. So it's kind of a word of warning that those plants that you put in your front yard may not stay where you put them. They may go elsewhere and they may wreak havoc where they arrive.